Don't touch that dial. You're tuned in to the Dread Podcast Network.
Welcome to Development Hell. I am your host, Josh Korngut. I am the managing editor of Dread Central. I am also a filmmaker in Toronto, Canada. This podcast is a proud member of the Dread Podcast Network. Usually on this podcast, we tackle topics of films that have been trapped in the development hell cycle, but for the next 4 episodes, we're going to be doing something a little bit differently. Stay tuned and find out more about Jeepers Creepers Unseen in just a moment. Jeepers Creepers is an iconic horror franchise spanning 20 years, 4 films, and a passionate fan base. But this community has become increasingly divided as public awareness surrounding its creators' disturbing crime continues to rise. This new true crime podcast, Jeepers Creepers Unseen, aims to unearth this controversial franchise by reviving its past, contextualizing the harm perpetrated by its creator, and by also taking an honest look at why this property is important to so many horror fans. With a 4th movie now out from new filmmakers, Jeepers Creepers Unseen aims to ask if this well-loved film series can reckon with history and thrive, or is now the time to move on. We're looking for these answers and more on the all-new 4-part limited audio series, Jeepers Creepers Unseen. Episode 2, the Jeepers Creepers franchise. On today's second episode of the Jeepers Creepers Unseen limited series, we're going to take a critical look at the original 3 films of the franchise. These are the films written and directed by series creator Victor Salva. And over the course of 2 decades, we're going to see how the accountability of his actions slowly overwhelmed his ability to create. With me, I am joined by Jules Bruyn. Jules is a trauma-informed counselor who specializes in addictions and mental health. She's going to help us look at these 3 films with a critical eye. We're not going to be discussing the 4th film of the franchise, as we're going to dig into that one on episode 4. Jules, how's it going?
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. Can you do me a favor and reintroduce yourself to the Dread Central audience?
Yeah, so I'm Jules, or Juliana Bruyn, and I'm a good friend of Josh's, full disclosure. But yeah, I'm a counselor out of Toronto, Canada. I specialize in addictions and mental health from a trauma-informed lens, which means I see everything through the lens of past trauma and how trauma impacts our day-to-day lives.
What do you do sort of on a day-to-day basis? What does your average workday kind of look like?
I have 2 jobs, kind of. My full-time job is working with women and gender queer folks that are involved with the criminal justice system. So either have had charges laid against them or are at risk of sort of having charges laid against them, that kind of thing. And then in the evening, I have a private practice that I opened up about a year ago. So we're working with a diverse kind of people with whatever kind of is going on for them, whatever's coming up for them day to day.
Why is this the field that you sort of found yourself drawn to?
Honestly, I always knew I'd want to do something in the helping field. And when I was 16, I was lucky enough to get a placement at a psychiatric ward of a hospital. So I worked on the psychiatric ward for about 7 years and got to really understand mental health and what that looked like from the medical model. I can't say I particularly love the medical model, but I understand its place in our world. And I really just fell in love with folks that had mental illness. And I really realized sort of systemically how we were really not serving them and how as a society we failed them. And so I just really wanted to do as much as I could to be an ally, an advocate, and like a support person for folks that had mental health and substance use problems.
I know you're not necessarily a huge horror movie fan.
No.
And I'm wondering, based on your profession, do you find yourself when you watch horror films taking a look at them from a victim-informed lens or from a more social work angle? Like, is this a way that you find yourself viewing movies?
Definitely. I think it kind of ruins horror movies for me a little bit because I can't help but do that. So there's a lot of horror movies that I just can't watch because it just is too. I'm just like watching people get like traumatized, literally tortured, abused, and it's just too real for me. Um, talking to folks day to day about the trauma, that kind of trauma that impacts them, I can't watch it happen on the screen. I
Mhm.
think we've also had arguments where I'm like really literally taking the text of different horror movies, and you're like, it's a movie, like it's magical, like you know what I mean. And I'm really seeing it from this really critical social work lens, like, oh, they're insinuating trauma there, they're insinuating like sexual abuse there, and I'm really like looking for that. So I think it's constant. I kind of can't get away from it, and I think it kind of does ruin me as a horror fan.
Well, it definitely gives you a unique perspective, and I'm very excited to have you here today.
That's generous of you. Thank you.
So I made you watch the first 3 films in the Jeepers Creepers franchise. What was your initial relationship with? Have you seen these movies before these watches?
So I thought I'd only seen the first, but it turns out I've only seen the second in the past. And I did see the second in theaters when I was in
Mhm.
grade 6 or 7, when it was out in theaters. I remember loving it at the time, but
Mhm.
then I never went back to it just because, again, like horror isn't exactly my thing. And usually when I watch horror, it's because you, Josh, forced me to watch a movie. So you just hadn't forced me to watch these until now. Yeah, I remember liking it, and I actually never knew of the allegations until you told me about them that you were going to do this podcast.
I do find a lot of not just horror fans, but people that watch these movies don't know about the context. So that's kind of why we're here.
Yeah,
So if it's okay with you, Jules, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off with a little bit of historical context for when the first film came out, and then we're going to take a dig into each of the films one by one. 2001 is the year that the first Jeepers Creepers film came into theaters. And in my opinion, the year 2001 was a transitional year for horror films. We were seeing a hard pivot and sort of this long death of the slasher film in moving towards what I think is more of like a fun, violent, and supernatural era in horror. Some examples is we were seeing the swan song of the slasher genre with movies like Valentine and Jason X, but this is also the time where we're seeing the rise of thoughtful horror releases like Frailty, The Others, a movie I know you like,
one of my
and
favorite horror
Session,
movies.
yeah, and Session 9. Just a couple years before, in 1999, saw the launch of Dark Castle Entertainment with the release of House on Haunted Hill, which you've seen, right?
It's great, so good.
Yeah, it's very good. So this movie came out between the releases of, I believe, Scream 2 and Scream 3. It was followed by 13 Ghosts, which was sort of a similar supernatural, gory tone.
I
And
also love
this,
that film.
yeah, they're both amazing films. I'm also a really big fan. But this sort of mini era of horror was a bridge between the slasher era and the era of remakes, which began, I guess, in 2002, but really started to take or snowball in the later 2000s. So after Scary Movie, the parody, which made audiences sort of unable to take slasher films seriously in the same way that they once did, well, we got the second film, Scary Movie 2, which came out in 2001, and that took a hard pivot to spoofing ghost movies and supernatural thrillers. So I think that like watching what Scary Movie was paying attention to with in the year 2000, they were focused on Scream and I Know It Till Last Summer. By the second one, they're starting to spoof movies like this. So just before the remake craze really took hold with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003 and House of Wax in 2005, we have this movie, Jeepers Creepers, which is part slasher film, part supernatural horror film, very fun in tone, but at the same time relentless, really scary and gross. So it was kind of like, in my opinion, a bridge between the slasher era and, well, the remake era, which led us to 2001 when Jeepers Creepers came out. Jules, would it be okay with you if I just gave everyone a bit of a refresher on the context of the first film?
Yeah, can I just also interject that I didn't realize this time of movies I liked so many of these movies. Again, as not a horror fan, like I guess this was like I really liked this
Mhm.
transitional period for some reason. Anyways, sorry.
Well, I think it also has something to do with our age group, right? This
Oh
was around the
yeah,
time you and I were 12, 13. These movies unofficially were really marketed towards us.
that makes so much sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Oh, I fell hook, line, and sinker. Anyways, sorry.
And listen, there's just nothing best. There's nothing better than dark castle films, as
Oh
you and I
yeah,
sort of agree
yes,
on.
yeah.
And it's sort of my dream to one day host a miniseries about Dark Castle films and call it Dark Castle Cast. So if you
Love
want to
it.
hear that, let us know on Twitter. So the first film in the Jeepers Creepers franchise was released on August 31st, 2001. They made it for about 10 million bucks, and it was created by filmmaker Victor Salva, who we've continued to talk about. The film itself garnered about 60 million worldwide, making it a modest hit for the horror genre. The film stars Gina Phillips and Justin Long as siblings, and we also have the performance of the Creeper by Jonathan Breck. And Jonathan Breck would continue to play this role for the second and third films. If I had to turn to you, Jules, and someone asked you, what is the first Jeepers Creepers film about? How would you answer that?
Thinking from like a very plain, simple lens, I would just say, like siblings on a road trip get killed
Yeah.
by a creeper. From my social worker lens, it seemed much deeper for me. I begrudgingly really loved it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was quite beautiful in a lot of ways, and I think it actually brought up a lot of themes around abuse and emotion and lots of stuff that I think were like quite subtextual, but quite clear for me, anyways, when I was
Yeah,
watching the film.
definitely present. We were saying how this is a film about two siblings, and you're right. They're
Mhm.
on a road trip and they encounter some pretty severe violence at the hand of this new cinema monster, kind of an
Mhm.
icon at this point, the Creeper. Jules, who is the Creeper? What is the deal with this monster in this film? How is he unique?
Honestly, I think what's unique about him is that is first like really not seeing him, which I mean they've done before in like Friday the 13th and Halloween's and stuff, where you don't sort of fully you see, well, I guess, but with the creeper you see him but you don't see his face. He's like covered with the hat and the coat, so it's quite mysterious because you're like, is he
Hmm.
magical, is he not magical? Like you don't really know until the end that he is this full magical creature.
Yeah.
So at first it just feels like kind of a regular old serial killer, and then it kind of keeps evolving and unfolding, and that's how it gets scarier and scarier. It's like the build kind of really, it really pays
Yes.
off, and it's really frightening by the end.
Yeah, so we learn a little bit more about this murderous, sort of human hungry creature as the film continues. But something I resonate with and sort of, I don't know, I always like in horror is the archetype of the boogeyman. It's
Oh yeah.
something that I always kind of find myself drawn to, from Freddy Krueger to, as we talk about sometimes, that character in Buffy, to Kinderstad. There's so many different the Babadook, I guess, is a modern iteration of the boogeyman, and they're always sort of a mysterious figure. You don't see their face, and often they will be dressed with like a hat and a coat, sometimes formal, sometimes not. The Crooked Man, another
Yeah.
example of what the boogeyman sometimes appears like.
Yeah, and I think the boogeyman is kind
Mhm.
of also stems from that sort of the night terrors that people have, or sorry, the sleep paralysis demons
Yes,
that people
yes.
see, and one of them is the man in the hat, right? And so I really
Mhm.
think that's sort of I felt that very strongly in this movie as well. That sort of man in the hat,
Yeah.
horrifying, dream-like person.
Why do you think, if you had to guess, why people experiencing sleep trauma or sleep paralysis tend to have a vision of that archetype? What is about it that you think maybe could connect the dots?
It makes me think of, and this is just totally my random thought, of like doctors and things like that. Whereas in the past and
Mhm.
still in the present, they can be quite traumatic figures. They have a
Mhm.
lot of power. They're typically men. They can do quite horrible things to us. They have done horrible things to us in the past. There's this really sense of like vulnerability with them and unknowing. And think about things like the plague doctors and all these other and the ways that they looked. And I think that sort of there's a similarity to that in this like man in the hat boogeyman aesthetic.
Yeah. And we haven't really touched base on it yet, but in this podcast, we've gone over quite a bit about the crimes committed by director-writer Victor Salva towards a child that starred in his first film, Clown House. The child's name is Nathan Forrest Winters. So we're taking a look at the Jeepers Creepers films through the lens of knowing that this is someone who has perpetrated some pretty terrible crimes, and looking around to see if there's any context or clues to sort of see if we can connect the dots a little bit. Do you have any initial thoughts on the subject?
Knowing about the horrific crimes that were committed against this child by Victor Salva, it was hard not to notice the moments of inappropriate, which I think there's a lot of sexual gratuity in horror movies as it is, but to kind of go in with the context of this man is a predator, it was hard to sort of to make it maybe have a blind eye around some of the sort of glaring things that were going on in these films.
Well, is there anything that stood out to you as especially concerning?
First and foremost, just even the way the leads that he chooses in all the films, not to kind of jump around, are quite young looking boys that are supposed to be playing like young teens, I believe, like maybe like 16. And the amount of toplessness, the amount of, just sort of, they are just sweating and naked. And I mean, me and you spoke about this, the peeing. Every single one of his movies, there is like a full scene of young men peeing, and it's quite long, these scenes. And, in the second one, they're shivering from their pee. Like, it just feels so gratuitous. It feels feels inappropriate. It feels like doesn't make the plot go any further. But he chose to make that a through line through all of his films is a very, I definitely have like a big question mark on that.
Yeah, there's definitely a steely male gaze directed firmly at the young men in these films. And a big part of it that really stood out to me was my perception of the fetishization of peeing, like this water sports fetish kind of, because you see it really present in each of the films. Like, you see the urine, you see the response to the urination. It's like very sexualized.
Yeah, and not to like jump too much to the second film, but there's a part in the really long peeing scene where they're all peeing out on this field. You see the creeper flying over them, and it feels very much like somebody peeping on people in the bathroom. Like, it felt so predatory, like of this creeper watching them pee, and it felt it just gave me such a ick. Yeah.
Another thing that sort of struck me as situationally icky was, well, to give a little bit of context, in the film, the creeper gets your scent. And if he gets your scent, he's going to decide if he's going to eat you. And if he does, he's going to decide which part of you he's going to devour. And once he decides, like, there's no escape, he's going to get you and he's going to eat that part of you. And a big part of that is his ability to catch somebody's scent. And there's a lot of like pretty direct like sniffing of boys, sniffing of underwear, and it just struck me as fetishistic. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, in the first one, the underwear that he's sniffing of Justin Long's are like tidy whities, which you think of as more of a younger underwear. And in the underwear, Justin Long's character's name is written on them, which also feels very young, right? So the creeper smells these underwear, and then Justin Long's like, oh my God, now he knows my name. It felt so bizarre. And again, like he had to point out that he smelled his underwear, point out that his name was written on the underwear. It felt so like it felt like it was an homage to, like, of course he's smelling like young boys underwear,
And of course this is all just conjecture. Like, this is just things that worth noticing, but it's hard it's hard not to notice stuff like this, after viewing these films, aware of the crime committed by Salva.
And I just also want to talk about that smelling of fear, and how it really brought up for me the sort of how pedophiles choose their victims, and choose who to groom, because that's quite a thing where a lot of perpetrators, pedophiles, things like that, have certain signs that they're looking for in young people, so that they know that they will be sort of the right victim to groom, so that they can do certain atrocities to them. And I felt that in this sort of through line of like smelling fear, and only certain people have the smell, and only certain people, that sort of picking. It really felt like this choosing the person to groom, choosing the person to assault. Like, it felt like a weird sort of homage to that, which made me feel quite uncomfortable. And and I would have thought was an interesting concept to explore if I didn't know that he himself was a perpetrator of that.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
what are the signs that, abusers are sometimes looking for in
Yeah.
victims? Like,
Things like bad homes, isolated, all those things that make you sort of more vulnerable, essentially. Looking for adult validation, those kind of stuff. Not a safe social group to talk to, that kind of thing.
mhm.
All the things that are quite sad to think about. Uh, Really, when they've talked to perpetrators, they've said, yeah, you're looking for that in what you're doing. When you see that, it's quite, that's that person's like going to be easier to groom versus others.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I found another moment in the film to be kind of sexualized in an interesting way,
Hmm.
but not necessarily in like a pedophilia way at all. But do you remember the moment where the creeper sort of severs the head of, I think, an attractive male cop,
Hmm.
and he picks it up and he looks like he's making out with the severed head, but
Yes.
really he's like pulling out the tongue. Do you think that was like a moment of campy sort of sexuality, or do you think it was just supposed to be straight on horror?
So I thought it was sexual, and I thought of it like I think of Freddy, who I think of Freddy in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies being sort of sexual as well, and I
Mhm.
think he is sort of attracted to his victims as well. And I felt that with the creeper. Like I did feel like it was sexual for him. The eating was sexual for him. The fact that he's eating the tongue felt quite deliberate. You know what I mean? And I think there was camp in it for sure, and that's why it plays well. But I think it was supposed to be sexual for sure.
It's so strange
It
watching
is.
this film in the year 2022, because while there are some pretty glaring smoke signals, like what we've already discussed, it's a pretty well made, effective, and fun horror movie. Would you agree?
So agree. And again, like I said, I begrudgingly really liked it. Like I went in not wanting to like it because I knew all this
Yeah.
stuff. And as I was watching it and seeing all these moments that were so clear to me, or I don't know if I'm, maybe I'm reading in too much. I could totally believe that as well. I was like, oh, and getting the ick and getting frustrated, getting angry, but I was also like, I was scared and I was on the edge of my seat and I was totally entertained. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we weren't alone. From Slate, critic David Edelstein compared Salva to Spielberg in his review for the film. So here's what he had to say. Salva has some of the young Spielberg's graphic ingenuity, and he's aiming for a more fairy tale dreamlike, irrational dread, a child's dread, not of psychos and hockey masks, but of winged demons who hide in the shadow at the other end of the drainage pipes, waiting for no discernible reason to carry you off and do despicable things to you in a clammy cellar. I don't know if Edelstein sort of knew the context
I
of Salva when he wrote it, but it's quite an interesting take.
I was literally going to say, did he know what he was saying there?
I don't
Because to
know.
me, that sounds so. Again and again, is this us reading into it because we know what we know, or
Hmm.
were people hinting at it? Did people know? And I would
Hmm.
not be surprised if people did. Everyone absolutely knew what was
Hmm.
going on because we allow predators in Hollywood and in
I
life.
don't think everyone knew. I think um I think some people did, and I think over the course of the last 30 years, people have become more and more aware. But it's hard to know in 2003, when not everybody was living on Twitter, what people knew and what people didn't know, and also what they cared about and what they gave value to. Before we continue on into other films, Jules, I'm wondering if you have any other notes on this first film.
Yeah, and some of the things I noticed in it that were kind of nice were around. I think there was signs in this movie that the sister was in an abusive relationship
Uh huh.
with her partner that she didn't really want to talk about, that she was sort of running from in some ways in this movie. And I actually found that really interesting. And even just like the brother being like, what's going on, why don't you want to talk about him, and sort of that sort of shutting down. And then when they first see the license plate and it says be eating you, but they said beating you, and she flinches because she's clear, she's being beaten by this man. And then he goes, "They're the license plate," and she like, you know what I mean. She kind of looks back down, and you can tell. So there are these like really, I thought, interesting moments of, you know, other abuse that's going on, and like siblings trying to be supportive of each other, and those were things I really liked in this movie from a social work perspective. But yeah.
Hmm. In our first episode, we get into the details of Salva's own upbringing, where there was a lot of physical abuse.
Mhm.
And I'm not, I don't know if that was the context for him wanting to include stuff like that in the film, but he
Yeah.
definitely is a filmmaker that comes from that experience, a lived experience.
It definitely felt like that. It definitely felt like he really understood the nuances. And
Hmm.
I appreciate, and listen, trauma begets trauma. So I totally appreciate, and I did listen to your first episode, that it sounds like he had a very horrific traumatic past. And
Hmm.
some of the symptoms of that can be inflicting trauma on others. That doesn't excuse what he's done. It just is, is what it is.
Yeah, it's always a complicated thing to talk about because, of course, it doesn't excuse the crime, but it does contextualize it. Excuse me. It does contextualize it to some degree. I'm wondering if you could maybe, if we could ask you a little bit about that, because I think it's something that, we people not in the social work or in the mental health fields sort of know about in passing, that people who are abused are more likely to turn out to be abusers. Is that true, or is that a myth?
No, it is true. Yeah, it is true. It is a common thing that can happen. And I mean, usually when people are showing, what can even happen is if young children are showing sort of predatory behavior, or over sexualized behavior when they're young, that's a big warning sign that they may be being sexually molested or abused. Because that's how we, as a trauma response, sort of play out what's going on for us. And our brains are really incredible things. The way that we keep ourselves sort of safe, or the way that we survive the things that we've gone through, is pretty incredible. So a lot of things can be things like sexualizing our trauma. So, reframing our trauma in a sexual way, reframing our sexual trauma in a way of like, there was desire there was enjoyment there. And that can then lead to, when you see people that were the age that you were, sexualizing them as well. Now, that doesn't go for all people that were molested. Please don't think that I am saying that at all. But that can be something that comes up for folks, and that can be why they then become perpetrators themselves.
Very interesting. Jules, before we move on to the second film, what are your other thoughts about the first Jeepers Creepers?
I, I really liked it. I thought it was a 4 out of 5, and it's funny. I thought it was really nuanced. Sorry, is what I will say. And it was scary, and it's hard. I do get scared still, but these kind of movies don't necessarily scare me. And I was pretty scared by this. Um,
Hmm.
but that's pretty much all I have to say about the first one.
So, Jeepers Creepers 2 came out in 2003, about 2 years after the first film, and was also written and directed by Victor Salva. A direct sequel to the first film, it includes a demonic creature who stalks a yellow school bus that generally has a football team on it. These are mostly a cast of young, attractive men in various degrees of dress. Francis Ford Coppola did return as an executive producer, as he was on the first film. This time we see Ray Weiss as a lead role. His name was Jack, and this is a man who's trying to avenge the presumed death of his young child, who in the opening sequence of this film is carried off by the creeper. It was released in theaters on August 29th, 2003, had mostly negative reviews from critics, but it was a big hit. It only took $17 million to make and grossed between 63 and $120 million worldwide. I know that's a very different number, but there are sort of different records on hand. So we're not exactly sure how much this film earned, but there's a chance that it earned upward of $120 million. Yeah. Robert Ebert wrote in his review of the second film, Victor Salva's Jeepers Creepers 2 supplies us with first-class creature, a fourth-rate story, and dialogue possibly created by feeding the screenplay into a pasta maker. Would you say that there's truth to that? Do
I
you agree
think
with
there
Mr.
kind of
Ebert?
is truth to that. I
It's kind
mean,
of rude.
it's rude. I mean, there was issues with the dialogue. There was
Yeah.
issues with the script for sure.
Hmm.
And I think there's truth to that. I don't always love Roger Ebert, and I know he's not always a horror fan, but
No.
um, there were
Pasta maker.
some past make is pretty wow. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I
It's
kind
pretty
of hear
rude.
where he's coming from.
Yeah, so this film, I'm going to try to put it in my own words. So I forget the exact timeline. I think it's either before or after the events of the first film, just by a day or so. And the creeper is still feeding. And there's this school bus, like an old rickety school bus, chock full of young football players. And they're like chanting their very like raucous, toxic masculine chant, something about cocks.
That talks, yeah.
And yeah, which was a chant written by Mr. Salva himself, because at the very end credits it's actually listed as him, which is a little creepy because
Oh
the word
God.
cock is in it a lot. But there are other people on this bus. So there's the bus driver, there's the coach, and there's a couple of cheerleaders who are there to support the football players at their big game.
Three.
There is some bizarre like racial tension on the bus between the white members of the team and the black members of the team. And we were talking about how it's very strange. Like sometimes it just feels like the film is dabbling in racist territory, and other
Oh,
times it feels like it's commenting on race issues, but it's not clear to me.
it's like it's literally holding the line between like white saviorism and being racist, which is
Hmm.
it's uncomfortable all round and wrong all round. Like it was really weird.
It's very strange. There's also a psychic cheerleader who's my favorite character in the film, named Minxie, I think, who, while on the bus, has this flash of a young man, Justin Long from the first film, warning her that they're in danger and that the creeper is after them. Turns out she's right, and the creeper uses throwing stars,
Yeah, you're not
one
throwing
of his
stars.
throwing
Yeah,
stars, and blows out the tires of the bus. As the night gets darker, the creature shows up, the creeper shows up, and picks them off one by one. And a lot of the film takes place in this one location on the bus as tensions rise between the survivors.
and there.
Would you say that's an accurate description?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that she actually has the vision after they've already been
Ah,
one or two people have been killed.
that's right. I think there was a couple of visions that she has.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, you're right. There is a couple. The major one that I'm thinking of. You're right. That
Mhm,
she
you
just
were,
sees people going, go,
yeah,
go.
you're
The
right.
major one is after people. I know because I wrote in my notes in both these films. There's not a lot of believing women. That's a pretty. It's a pretty through line that people don't believe women in these films. You know, in the first one, not listen to they. You know, Justin
Yeah.
Long doesn't allow his sister to listen to her gut, and like they're going to the stores and they're saying no, it didn't happen. And then in this one too, after people have literally died, they've seen a man flying over them. This young woman says, you know, he's going to pick us off. This is what I was told, and they're like, "You're crazy." I'm like, I think she's pretty right. We've just seen people
Listen, she's
fly
a psychic
away.
cheerleader named Minxie. I would have questions.
I would marry her. It sounded that's great.
Yeah. We were talking about how there's some bizarre like racial tensions in the film, but I would also say that there's some bizarre use of homophobia. And I'm also unsure if these moments of homophobia are the film being homophobic or the film commenting on toxic masculinity and homophobia. Now we know that Salva himself is a queer creator, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't pure moments of homophobic nature in the film. How do you feel
Sure.
about that?
Yeah, I was constantly curious if this movie was just the epitome of toxic masculinity. And this is the time that toxic masculinity was at an all-time high in the world. I mean, I guess it's always at an all-time high, but I feel like it was really loved, beloved almost. Or if it was commenting on it because it was so overt and so bizarre. The amount of toxic masculinity, the grossness, the misogyny, the all that stuff. Yeah, I was curious knowing it was a queer man that made this. I was like, is he saying something, or is this also a bit of a fetishization of this sort of like, you know, putting masculine men up on a pedestal, which does happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like a lot of the male physique sort of on display. We're seeing a lot of interest in the naked male form. There's a lot of like dudes sort of walking around without their shirts on, and
Yeah, it felt, I wrote so many times, this feels like erotic, this feels like softcore porn. Like there were so many moments of that I kept feeling like something was going to happen, that there was going to be kissing. I mean, this movie would have been a little more interesting, but no, actually I liked it. But it did feel strangely sexual. But I will say, and I wonder if this is also why the audience liked it. It was really interesting for the really intense male gaze not to be on women,
yeah,
and I'm not used to that. It was sort of it
hmm
was
and
it
not a
was sort of
commentary
liberating.
either.
No, it
Because
was
usually when
just
the male gaze is reversed or extracted, it's a
yes.
commentary on it. But this time I didn't feel that way.
No, and it still felt sexual and objectifying and all those horrible things that the male gaze has, but it just wasn't directed towards women, which it just sort of felt, yeah, liberating, freeing. Maybe that's wrong to feel, but it did feel that way.
hmm
And it was just interesting to watch this still kind of weirdly sexual, why is this, gratuitously sexual movie, but it's
hmm
not about women. We're not seeing like, full frontal of girls. It's all men. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that as sort of a woman watching and from your POV as a woman, because whenever the male gaze is directed to dudes, there's a little part of me that feels a little bit uncomfortable because I'm not used to it. It's
Yeah.
not what I'm sort of spoon fed in the same way as it is when women are in the gaze.
For sure. And I also wonder if that's why things also were able to slide by, right? Because, like, people maybe feel a little uneasy, but don't want to sort of call it to the table in that way.
Yeah. Um, we've talked about Patrick Goldstein, a writer from the LA Times. In his article, Victor Salva's Horror Stories, he has this to say. One sticking point to the debate over Salva involves his work as a horror director. Most of his films are populated with young men who are terrorized by killers, convicts, and scary monsters. But his detractors find a darker parallel between Salva's crime and his films. At the time of Powder's release, a police officer in charge of the Los Angeles Police Department's unit for sexually exploited children was disturbed that Salva was allowed to be in a position of authority on a movie set, saying, as long as he's in a position to be around kids, he's a threat to kids. After seeing Jeepers Creepers in 2003, New York Daily News film critic Jamie Bernard told the San Jose Mercury News, it's a naked exploitation of Salva's own inner disturbances. He's just rubbing our noses in the very crime he committed. For Salva, his preoccupation with young men in fearful situations comes from a very different place. All these films about young men in scary situations are a mirror on my own childhood, he says. When you're a filmmaker, you make movies about what you know. I'm going to try to have us wrap up our thoughts on the second
Mhm.
film. So we were thinking that, there's a little bit more like obvious eroticism around the male form in this one than the second in this one rather than the first one. Would you agree
Yeah, it's
or
more
disagree?
overtly sexual. Absolutely, I would agree. Even, him licking the creeper licking the window and winking and all that stuff. It feels much more overt than it was in the first one.
How did the film sort of stack up against the first one?
Um, I saw them sort of. Watched one day and the other one the next day, and I wish I had a little more time in between, because the first one I found so good that this one kind of did not stack up that well. That being said, I found this one quite fun,
hmm
and it gave me a lot of, this boogeyman that we were talking about, this, this archetype. I do like the idea of, like, fear being more, making you more vulnerable, or being a bad thing. Thinking about movies like Dead Silence, which I know is one of your favorites.
Yep.
Screaming is how she can kill you. And, being the boogeyman, which was a horrible movie, but that actual movie, how he killed him was by facing him, right? And I
hmm
sort of liked that was in here too, that, like, if you didn't have fear and if you were more confident, then he wouldn't want to take you away. And I thought that was kind of,
Oh,
I found that kind of fun.
was that
um
proven in this? Like, were there people that
yeah.
were more confident and they weren't picked?
Yes, there was someone who was scared. The guy with the glasses was really scared at first, and then he was less scared, and then the creeper didn't end up taking him because he didn't want him anymore.
Oh,
And I
wow.
thought
I
that
never
was
clocked that. That's so creepy.
What I thought, listen, if I'm wrong, that's what I clocked. But anyway, so I thought that was sort of an interesting, fun piece. And I've liked that in other movies too. So I sort of like that. So I found this movie fun and campy. Again, predatory
Hmm.
stuff aside. But it wasn't like the first one, which I thought was scary and nuanced.
Yeah, yes, I agree. Although, as a fan, I think maybe I even prefer the second film just because of the tone shift. But there's no doubt that the first one is higher quality.
I also felt like the women in this one were like really useless, whereas the women in the first one, the sister was, like was a part of it, was an active part of it. Whereas
Hmm.
this one, like, yes, that woman had a vision, but they were just sort of there to be hot. It felt
Yeah,
like the studio was like, you need to put some women in this.
yeah.
And so he was like, ah, fine, here's three. That's what it felt like.
Something we haven't talked about was the violence perpetrated against a young child in the opening scene. How did you feel about that opening sequence?
So if I didn't know what I know, I would have just sort of let it happen and been like, oh, it's scary because he's killing a kid, which is always that sort of scary thing, you kind of that rule that you think they're not going to break in horror movies.
Mm.
But knowing what I know, it felt incredibly uncomfortable. It felt, I mean, the age of the kid was kind of,
Well, before, in case people don't remember, what was the setup? What was the opening sequence like?
yeah, so basically they're on a farm and he has to go fix all the his dad thinks he broke his auger, which was like a thing, or his hole puncher or something. I forget what it was. And the little boy has to go into the field alone, and he's kind of scared of the
Scarecrows.
scarecrows, exactly. And then one of them, of course, smells that he's scared, and it's the creeper, and he takes him away. And it
Yeah.
also felt very like boy alone, fighting with his father. Like it just felt super predatory.
And do you think that, like, it's only because we know the context of the creator, or do you think that there's an okay chance that there is a little bit of connective tissue between the issue and and that scene?
I think there's definitely connective tissue. Even, when you read that quote, hearing Salva say, I write what I know and I write my life, like I definitely felt that a lot in these movies. And I think that's what made them powerful, is that there was this truth in it and this honesty in it, and but not a nice honesty. But I think absolutely seeing this boy alone fighting with his family, fierce, looking around and kind of getting picked off, it felt so right on the money. Yeah.
Before we move on to the third film, I was wondering, did you have any other notes or observations about the second film in the series?
N- Not really, except for that it was like more overtly sexual, like we talked about. It was interesting. I didn't love the sort of vengeance storyline of the dad trying to find his, like, young son's killer, but and I
Hmm.
thought the ending was real bad. Of like, you can see him for $5. I was like, this is not for
Something you
me.
said that I found interesting was, yeah, Hollywood kind of has this unspoken rule in horror that you're not going to kill kids, and sometimes they do. Why do you think we have that rule? Why do you think we have that unsung?
Yeah, I just think, yeah, women and children are off limits, but women aren't. But there's something about killing a kid that feels so scary and feels so cruel, you
Hmm.
know? And I
Hmm.
think maybe it's from the old code times or something, but like that just didn't happen. We never did it, and it wasn't. And then that dam has been broken, and we definitely kill kids now. But it did feel for a very long time like kids didn't die in movies, and they would always live, and which was good because the movie wasn't mean enough or something to kill a kid. But there's something so vulnerable about children,
Hmm.
that feels so scary when a predator takes them out.
Yeah, definitely. Which is a big chunk of why it's so upsetting that Salva really didn't pay much time in prison, that there wasn't a whole lot of accountability paid for such a gruesome act. If it's okay with you, Jules, maybe we can jump a little bit into the third film and the final one, directed and
Yes.
written by Salva.
Hmm.
So, a long while after the release of the second film, which happened in 2003, finally we saw a third film. So, in 2017, Jeepers Creepers 3 was finally unleashed, also written and directed by Victor Salva. and it takes place in between the events of Jeepers Creepers and Jeepers Creepers 2. One of the returning actors was Jonathan Breck as the Creeper, but we also get to see a cameo from Gina Phillips, who plays the sister in the first film, and she returns at the end as Trish and sort of declares war on the Creeper, and she's going to get her revenge in 23 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in between that happening in the opening, it's a very confusing film in my opinion. We have a totally new cast of characters. Two young people, Addison and Buddy, I believe, are sort of part of the focus. We also have an older woman in the film, played, I believe her name was Galen, who's one of the more interesting facets of the film. And she has visions of her dead son, Kenny, who was killed by the Creeper. And at some point, she gets her hands on a severed limb that belonged to the creature, and she gets a vision of what he's up to. Yeah.
This movie was a hard watch. It was not good.
It's pretty rough.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty bad. And you can just tell that it's made with a whole lot less than the first two films are made with. And it was also made like a long time after. And so maybe that lightning in a bottle was officially gone. In 2006, the film was initially announced, and we were told that Jeepers Creepers 3, The Creeper Walks Among Us, was going to be coming directly to DVD. But something happened, and there wasn't any financing, and this fell through. For many years, the development continued to sort of stir, and Salva produced a script called Jeepers Creepers 3 Cathedral, and I believe the intent behind that was to see Trish return, and this would sort of be Trish's story. However, 9 years passed, lots of hope sort of up and down, and the film sort of never came to be, and that whole script got scrapped. It wasn't until 2016 or 2015 when production actually began, and they went in a totally new direction. This time around, they filmed in Vancouver, Canada. And for the first time, I think, in the history of the series, there was some pretty striking repercussions for Salva's crimes. And so before the filming could begin, Canadian talent agencies set out this official alert to all the casting agencies with information about Salva's past. And because of this alert, production was actually halted for a moment, but yes, it did start up again. Jeepers Creepers 3 also caused a shitstorm online due to a specific line used in the film and the context of the child molestation perpetrated by Salva. So in the film, there's a line that a character speaks saying sort of about a character sexualizing an underage girl. He says, "Can you blame him? I mean, look at her. The heart wants what it wants. Am I right?" And so this is in reference to sexual abuse perpetrated towards a kid. And so this line was definitely pinpointed by critics of the film, connecting it to sort of the sexual abuse that he committed in the 80s. Did you clock this line when you watched it?
I didn't actually clock that line. That's very interesting. I had a hard time concentrating on this movie.
Yeah,
To be
me too.
fair, I was not in it the way I was in the other one, so I apologize for maybe missing that. I was confused. There wasn't a lot of story arc,
Mm-hmm.
But hearing that, I mean, that's really unsettling.
Yeah, very strange. And it's not the only time. Yeah, very strange stuff to
I'm
have
just
in your
also
film.
surprised no editor went, let's take it out, that they just
Well, it
sort of
was
allowed
ultimately
it.
removed from the theatrical release, but versions, sent to critics, it was there, so people saw it.
Wow.
So I don't know if it's on the streaming versions that are available now, but it's possible. Overall feelings was that this film was definitely not of the same caliber of the first two, that it was definitely lower budget, and that sort of was ineffective, I guess.
Yeah. It lacked those storyline or something. It felt like there were too many characters, and none of them are fleshed out. Whereas I feel like, I mean, and not in a, at least in the second one when they were kind of, two-dimensional, it was sort of campy and fun. It didn't feel that way in this one.
No. Although the one thing that did carry through was a prolonged scene of underage boys urinating.
Yes,
Um,
so bizarre.
Very bizarre. There's a scene, bright day, just like in the second film and in the first film. It all happens in the bright daytime, where, like, I believe an underage teen urinates. I think on the
On the truck.
property of the creature. Yeah, on the
On the
truck.
truck
Which,
of the creature, yeah. You see the stream of the pee,
oh, we
which is
see
like
it.
so.
Yeah, bizarre, and just like makes me wonder if there's fetish at play.
I think there has to be. There's no other, like, again, there's no reason for this in the storyline. This doesn't bring up anything. You know what I mean? There's no sort of, it
Need.
just feels, no need, thank you for the word. It just feels so gratuitous and overtly sexual. And yeah.
I could be reaching, but another moment that struck me as kind of strange is when the other teenagers are murdered by the creeper and they are sort of both penetrated into a tree, which is a trope I see in horror quite regularly, or a motif I see of like the double penetration death. And it always just makes me think of what you would imagine it makes me think of.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, I guess, when I think of the double penetration sex, it is in regards to people having sex and the killer kind of
Yeah.
killing them mid-sex.
Okay, yeah,
And
that's true.
but I think that was deliberate for this too, like the two boys getting doubly killed. Like, I wonder if that was supposed to be also a bit of a wink to sort of sex or sexiness or whatever.
I'm not sure, but it's like hard not to think about that in horror
Yeah,
films.
totally.
Do you do you have any thoughts, any closing thoughts on this strange low budget third film in this franchise?
I wish I had more to say on it. Other, it just really felt disjointed to me. It didn't feel as nuanced or interesting. But also, it did feel like, um, I mean, it was so Canadian. Me and Josh both
Yeah.
live in Canada, and we talked about this multiple times, how Canadian it was, and how many places I was like, oh my god, that's so Canadian. But I'm glad to know he had less behind him. I'm glad to know he didn't have the same money and the same backing, and
Yeah,
that acting studios or different studios were saying don't. And you felt that in this movie, that there was definitely less behind him
less
and
support.
less support, and I'm glad because, yeah. So
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, never mind like necessarily the context of Salva, but if someone commits a terrible sexual crime and let's say they're convicted and do serve a prison sentence, should they never be able to work in their chosen field again if, let's say, it's film?
mm. Ooh, I mean, this question is so there's no black and white. It's so gray,
Hmm.
it's easy to say absolutely they should never be able to work again, um
Hmm.
but unfortunately, I do believe in, learning from your mistakes and growing and rehabilitation. And so I want to believe that there is a world in which somebody can atone or, learn from their mistakes and kind of give back. But there has to be proof of growth. There has to be, real atonement. There has to be real changes made publicly, for somebody to then be, I think, kind of accepted back into a community, especially like film, television, music, these sort of industries that are so highly paid and also create role models, right? That's the real fear.
Hmm.
um,
It's
Sort of
interesting.
allowing these people. Yeah. So I think that's what's so tricky about this. Um, you know, Separating the art from the artist isn't as easy as I think sometimes we want it to be.
Well, the victim, Nathan Forrest Winters, has gone on record saying that he's only picketed the films by Salva where children are involved. When children are not involved, let's say Jeepers Creepers, the first film, he doesn't sort of he doesn't want to stop him from creating films. It's only when a child is put in a situation that he cares. He doesn't believe that he should stop making films. And I do think that's an interesting perspective. But you're right, it's not black and white. Every situation is totally unique, and it's just a really complicated issue.
Yeah, and I think like we need to listen to Nathan and like we need to listen to him with what he's saying as well. Like his voice is more important than ours in this. So I
Mm-hmm.
totally appreciate what he's saying. My only issue is this movie does feel like it's insinuating sexualizing of younger folks.
Yeah,
It doesn't feel fully adult. It doesn't feel fully, though every actor in this is, I'm sure, 18 or over. It still feels
probably.
quite, yeah,
In all of the
adjacent.
films, Justin Long definitely has an air of young boy
Yeah.
in the first film, how he's stylized, especially. The second film has a slew of underage characters that are sexualized and sort of, at least, the male gaze is firmly placed on them.
Mhm.
And then even this film, there's some bizarre use of teenage boys and even strange dialogue about what the heart wants, what it wants, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think the young boy, I guess the lead boy in this, I think is supposed to also be like, 15, 16.
Yeah.
And he's
That,
quite
yeah, the brother
freckled
character.
and
Yes, I
quite,
think so.
yeah, like he look, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that's my, and again, so that these are the things that to me really stand out when we do look at this really, layered question of separating the art from the artist, or can an artist atone, or can an artist kind of come back, is like if they're making things like this and they're showing to us that they haven't changed, and if anything they're sort of proud of, or maybe that's the wrong word, then no, that's not okay. Then
Possibly, yeah.
absolutely no, this is not.
And that's, of course, our read on it, but I
Of
think it's
course,
a
absolutely, yeah,
fair take to have.
yeah, like, yeah.
Hmm.
Anyways,
Jules, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about these films. I know it's not necessarily your favorite genre to explore, but
well,
I
thank
think
you
you
for
have a
having me.
really important perspective that I'm glad that we got to utilize.
I so appreciate you having me, and I so appreciate you doing this series, because I think it's important that folks know the history and not just sort of sweep it under the rug like it has been. So thank you for that.
Mhm. And for everyone listening at home, we are going to continue Jeepers Creepers Unseen in 2 weeks with our third episode. Until then, you may see a couple of things show up in the feed unrelated. Thank you for listening to another episode of Jeepers Creepers Unseen. Thank you so much for listening to Development Hell. If you enjoy this podcast, then please do us a major favor of leaving us 5 stars and writing a positive review. It really makes all the difference in the world. We'll see you next week with a brand new episode of Development Hell.
Thank you for listening to the Dread Podcast Network.